Hey, everybody, welcome back to another Wednesday night Bible study in our series on the Gospel of Mark. For the past 2 weeks in here, we have been asking the question, who is Jesus? And we've been seeing how different characters in the Gospel of Mark answer this question. And among the people, there are a variety of answers to this question, but no one seems to have a really clear grasp on who Jesus is. But the demons, the spiritual forces of darkness, they clearly know who they are dealing with. They know that Jesus is the Holy One of God and the Son of God. And we've mentioned before that Jesus is intentionally keeping his mission and his identity quiet for now. Often after healing someone, he tells them not to go spreading the news around. And we've also mentioned before that the kingdom Jesus is proclaiming has humble beginnings, and people are not sure what it's all about. And only those who really listen well to what Jesus is saying and doing, only they will learn the secrets of the kingdom. And so when we put all of these things together that we've seen so far in Mark, we see that there is a lot of mystery surrounding Jesus at this stage in the Gospel of Mark. We know who Jesus is as readers because Mark has told us in the very first verse. But among the characters in Mark, there is quite a bit of confusion and uncertainty, and this exists even among Jesus' close disciples. And we see this uncertainty and confusion even among the disciples on full display in our passage for tonight. Our passage is a series of events in Jesus' life that are connected together. And Mark seems to have put these events in the order he did on purpose to make a point. And so as we look at this section of Mark's presentation of Jesus' life and ministry, I think we'll learn some valuable things about what following Jesus means and what following Jesus does not mean. And this will teach us and remind us of some important things about following Jesus faithfully today. And so our passage for tonight is Mark 8, 1 through 26, and several things happen in these verses. In verses 1 through 10, Jesus miraculously feeds 4,000 men with 7 loaves of bread. And this is similar to another miracle back in chapter 6, where Jesus feeds 5,000 men with 5 loaves and 2 fish. And this other miracle, the feeding of the 5,000, that will also be important for tonight. And then in verses 11 through 13 of chapter 8, the Pharisees make a demand from Jesus for a sign from heaven to test him. And this exasperates Jesus, and he refuses to perform this kind of sign. And right after this, in verses 14 through 21, we read Jesus warning his disciples about the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Now, this might seem like an odd phrase at first, but you may already see a connection to the feeding miracle with the loaves of bread and this reference to leaven. And then at the end of our passage, Jesus heals a blind man. And this is a little bit different from some of Jesus' other healing miracles because this one involves 2 stages to healing the man. This is odd, and we're going to come back to this odd part of the healing here in a little bit. And I actually want us to begin by looking at this odd healing first, and then we'll go back to the beginning of our passage for tonight, and we'll walk through it from the beginning. But doing this, starting at the end with this odd healing, this will set the stage for what I want us to focus on tonight. So we read about this healing in chapter 8, verses 22 through 26, and it says, "And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, 'Do you see anything?' And he looked up and said, 'I see people, but they look like trees walking.' Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, 'Do not even enter the village.'" So again, the odd part about this miracle is how it involves 2 parts. A blind man is brought to Jesus, and we would expect Jesus to heal the man as easily as he has healed many others and cast out many demons by this point in Mark. But instead, Jesus heals the man partially at first by spitting on his eyes and laying hands on him. And then he asks the man if he sees anything. And the man says that he sees people, but they look like trees walking around. And that statement might imply that the man had not always been blind, since he seems to know what trees look like. But Jesus then lays his hand on the man again, and this time the man can see everything clearly. And so when we put this whole thing together, At first glance, Jesus seems like some kind of magical doctor more than the Messiah and the Son of God. He does something to try to heal the man. He has to ask the man if it worked, and when he learns that it only partially worked, he has to do something else. And that just doesn't sound like the Jesus that we have been reading each week in this class. And it seems odd that the Son of God would only partially heal someone at first and then have to ask about it when he ought to have enough power to heal the man instantly. Well, if we just look at this healing in isolation from its context, it can look like Jesus kind of goofed here, like he almost made a mistake and had an almost unsuccessful healing. But like I just said, this wouldn't be the same Jesus that we've been reading about. This is the only miracle that involves 2 steps to a full healing like this. And so instead of jumping to the conclusion that Jesus made a mistake, maybe we should take this as a signal that something significant is going on. And I think putting this healing in its context will show us what that significant thing is. And that significant thing has a lot of value for our understanding of Mark and our understanding of what it means to follow Jesus. So to get the context of this healing, let's back up to the start of our passage for tonight, which is the miraculous feeding of the 4,000. And we're probably pretty familiar with the gist of what happens in this miracle. Jesus is in a deserted place, and he is a good distance from any nearby villages and towns, and a great crowd has gathered around him. And Mark tells us that this crowd has been following Jesus for 3 days. Jesus has compassion on the crowd because he realizes that they need food, and with 7 loaves of bread, and also a few fish, Mark tells us, but with 7 loaves of bread, Jesus miraculously provides enough food to feed the entire crowd. And there are even 7 baskets full left over of bread. The main thing I want to point out for tonight is that this miracle was supposed to be more than just a miraculous provision of food. For Jesus' disciples, there was a deeper meaning that they were supposed to grasp, that they were supposed to pick up on. And we know this because of what Mark tells us after the earlier feeding miracle, which is the feeding of the 5,000 men. So after the feeding of the 5,000 in chapter 6, we immediately read of Jesus miraculously walking on the Sea of Galilee on a stormy night. And this act completely amazes the disciples, but Mark adds an interesting note at the end. Their stunned response to Jesus walking on the water was connected to their failure to understand about the loaves because their hearts were hardened. There was something about the feeding of the 5,000 with 5 loaves of bread that they were supposed to understand, but they didn't. So when the feeding of the 4,000 comes along, they receive a second opportunity to understand the same thing. So keep this in mind because we will come back to this here in a little bit. So the story continues in verses 11 through 13, where we read the Pharisees wanting a sign from Jesus. So let's read these verses together, verses 11 through 13. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." And he left them, got into the boat again, and went to the other side. So the Pharisees asking for a sign, this might seem a little bit confusing at first because by this point in Mark, Jesus has performed quite a number of miracles. So why did they need a sign? I think this request makes sense if we understand that the Pharisees did not just want Jesus to perform any old miracle. They wanted something else. There were a number of miracle workers, or at least people who claimed to be miracle workers, in the world at Jesus' time. This was not an uncommon thing. So working miracles alone, that doesn't necessarily prove that Jesus is the Messiah or that God is doing something new through him that hasn't been done before or anything like that. And so in asking for a sign from heaven, the Pharisees are asking for something irrefutable that would confirm to them exactly who Jesus is and what God is doing through him. They're asking for something more than what Jesus has already been doing. And this would also explain why Jesus refuses to give them this type of sign, even though he has performed a lot of miracles by this point. Jesus has demonstrated that he is more than willing to perform miracles, but he's not willing to give them this kind of sign. Jesus is not interested in providing irrefutable proof of who he is. He is interested in calling people to put their trust in him and follow him, and by doing this, become part of the kingdom of God he is proclaiming. And we mentioned before that understanding Jesus at this point in his ministry involves listening well to his sayings and also listening well to his actions. That's what Jesus wants people to do. He doesn't want to perform irrefutable signs on demand. He wants people to pay attention. He wants people to discern the significance of what he is already doing. And then after this, Jesus gets into a boat and crosses over to the other side of the sea. And the story continues in the boat. There, in verses 14 through 21, the disciples realize that they only have one loaf of bread with them. And this prompts Jesus to say, "Watch out, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." Now, this might seem like a strange phrase at first, but clearly Jesus is taking advantage of the presence of bread to make an illustration or to make a point. Leaven in Scripture is sometimes used to talk about corrupting influences that spread among people. The Apostle Paul talks about leaven in the same way when he warns the Corinthian Christians against celebrating immorality in the church instead of addressing it and dealing with it. Well, Jesus says here to beware of the corrupting influences of the Pharisees and the influence of Herod. Now, this combination, Pharisees and Herod, this might seem like a strange combination at first, but at the end of a series of controversies that we looked at earlier in this class, we saw that this same combination of Pharisees and Herodians, people associated with King Herod, we saw this same combination present. And notice that they seek to destroy Jesus in that verse. So the Pharisees and Herod, this is a dangerous combination. Jesus is warning his disciples about the stiff and the fierce opposition that will only continue to grow as Jesus' ministry progresses. But then notice what happens next. Instead of appreciating Jesus' warning, the disciples begin discussing among one another that they have no bread. Well, this is a natural concern. They have no bread. They need food. Disciples would have been expected to have food for their teacher and for other disciples, so they may also be embarrassed that they somehow failed in this responsibility and they don't have enough bread. But notice what Jesus says in response to this concern of the disciples. This is in verses 17 through 21. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up?" They said to him, 12. "And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up?" And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, "Do you not yet understand?" The disciples are failing to understand. Twice they have seen Jesus miraculously provide food, and yet food is still such a great concern for them that they are missing the importance of what Jesus is telling them. Now, to be fair to the disciples, Jesus has not miraculously provided food every time their supply got low. He has done this twice. And on every other occasion, apparently, they got their food the same way that everyone else did. But still, by now, the disciples ought to be getting the point that if they are with Jesus, they will be provided for. And they ought to be getting the point that Jesus does not perform miracles just to meet physical needs. These miracles point beyond the physical circumstances to spiritual realities, and they are failing to understand this. And in verse 18, Jesus' statement there is, I think, the most telling. He says, "Having eyes do you not see, and having ears do you not hear?" Remember before when we talked about how the key to understanding Jesus and his kingdom is listening well. Well, here the disciples are not listening well, and they are not seeing well either. And this is what brings us back to Jesus' miracle that at face value seems like some kind of mistake. I don't think it's a mistake at all. I think it is a miracle that is meant to make a point. Jesus touched a blind man and he could see, but he could not see with full clarity. And then Jesus touched him again and he could see clearly. Well, the disciples identify with this blind man. Specifically, they seem to identify with the blind man after Jesus has touched him for the first time. They are seeing what Jesus is doing. They know something amazing is happening, but they are not seeing these things clearly. They need a second touch, so to speak, from Jesus to see things as they ought to see them and to understand who Jesus is and what his mission is and what type of kingdom he is proclaiming. And we've made this observation before in here that this stage of Jesus' ministry, we mentioned this at the beginning of class tonight, this stage of Jesus' ministry is a time of confusion, a time of secrets, and a time of mystery. And even those who are best positioned to understand Jesus are failing to understand him. And this miracle demonstrates this reality in a concrete and in a dramatic way. So I don't think Jesus made a mistake at all. He knew exactly what he was doing when he healed this blind man in two stages like this. He was reenacting the way things were in the world around him. And next week, one apostle will suddenly have a moment of great insight. It will briefly look like he is finally seeing clearly, just like this blind man does after Jesus touches him a second time. But this clear vision is short-lived, and we will see that in many ways, even this one apostle is still blind as well. And it's not until after Jesus' mission on earth is complete and he overcomes death in the resurrection, it's not until then that his disciples will see clearly as this blind man does when Jesus fully heals him. But for now, they are seeing, but not as they ought to see. So next week, I'd like you to read chapter 8, verse 27 through verses 9 through 13. That's the main portion of text that we will be in. But thank you for joining us tonight. I hope that this was informative and encouraging to you. The Gospel of Mark is fascinating. I love getting to discuss it and read it and talk about it with you. And I hope that this is a blessing for you as well. Have a great rest of the week. Take care. Thank you.